Dr. Laporte is a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Montreal and a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Vermont, after which he was an instructor for 5 years at Harvard Medical School and then was a scientist and director at Pharmaceuticals, where he worked on novel peptide therapeutics, including a vasopressin receptor agonist, celepressin, for use in vasodilatory hypotension in septic shock patients. So comes to us with a lot of experience from the private sector, and he will be talking to us today about private sector career trajectories. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a little bit hard to to come after Dr. Mehta. It's like it's very humbling. I'm not very inspirational, unfortunately. So my talk is, let's say, mostly informative. But what happened is that you have, I guess they have the 2 PDF files, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
The 2 PDFs and this PowerPoint are on Triton Ed.
Okay.
You can access it now if
Yeah.
you like.
The PDF file will be, the PowerPoint file will be annoying because it's animated, but you have the PDF version of it. And there's a lot of links, and there's a lot of information also that I will just skip over. But that's interesting if you want to explore more about a career in the industry. That's worth looking at. And there's also a book chapter that goes more in depth on this. So let's get started. So just out of curiosity, you guys, you are not all from the summer cohort, correct? Because I recognize older faces, but which is good.
Around 3/4 are from
Yeah, so you probably, most of you have taken CLRE 236 with me, correct? So we know each other, which is great. So you should be relatively familiar with that, which is about drugs. But as you guys know, this would also apply to, roughly to also medical device and cell therapies and gene therapies. And what it is basically the life cycle. And we have research, we have development, eventually commercialization, and that starts with discovery and design, non-clinical and clinical development, and eventually commercialization, we have market access, marketing and sales. And this is a long process, that could, before we get to market, could easily take 8 to 10 years. And eventually, we lose patent protection after a little bit more than 20 years. And that's it, we start over again. So what's important is that we are dealing with an ecosystem. And that means, and that's important for you, because if you want to go into the industry, that means that there's a lot of different employers. And that's why we're going over this. So obviously, if we talk about drugs, we have the pharmaceutical companies. If we expand, not only for drugs, but other biomedical products, we also have biotechnology companies. And then we have consultants, both early in the process and late in the process. We have regulatory authorities. We have also what we call the contract organizations. So we have the contract research organization that do non-clinical work and clinical work. You also have the contract manufacturing organization, and nowadays you have like the humongous organization that do everything, development and manufacturing, the CDMOs. So these are also great employers. Then you also have the clinical research center, both academic and non-academic. And then you have clinical trial consortia, that would be a group of clinical research centers. And what else we have here? Whoops. I missed something. Did you caught what happened? Oh, okay. And the payers. The payers, obviously, healthcare insurers, hospital pharmacy, etc. So what you can see is that we have really a collection of potential employers. So what we'll look at here, we'll look at 3 groups of 3 groups that could be of interest in the industry for you, in clinical development, in commercialization and medical affairs, and in support and management that actually cover all these two groups there. So let's start with clinical development. So what's clinical development? So here, this is basically what it's responsible for. It's all the regulatory studies that are done with human subjects. So what does it take? Well, this is actually the segue with Dr. Mehta's talk. It's all about collaborations. So we're going back to people skills. This is so important because, as you will see, it's just this so many divisions. This is a very complex task, as you've seen from the first slide, to get from an idea out of science or clinical observation to a product at the end. There's an incredible complex path and many, many different groups of specialists involved. So definitely you need to have this ability to collaborate. And key concept there will be you have to do it with good clinical practice, good manufacturing practices. We'll get back to that a little bit later. And also what's important to understand with clinical development, we are familiar, or you may be familiar with what we call the pre-approval phase, where you're seeking market authorization for your product. But you will see, and we'll get at the end of the talk, that there's also something after you get your approval for the market. You have this post-approval phase where there's continued development there. And so that's also another opportunity to contribute to, and there's job opportunities there too. So who are involved? So first, clinical research. Well, this most direct application of the skills that you're learning in your master. And what it's responsible for? Well, it's responsible for the content of the clinical development plan. The clinical development plan, that's a fundamental elements of clinical trials and things that you are learning indeed. So basically is defining the strategy, doing the planning, overseeing the methodology, and coordinating the overall management of the clinical trials. And here it's important because you will see that we're dividing clinical development into early and late clinical development. And well, if you've done 236 with me, you know that phase 0, that's like translational medicine incarnate, that's the exploratory trials. Phase 1, in the healthy volunteers, or phase 1B, if, for instance, in oncology, where you will do that in patients, and phase 2A, clinical proof of concept, where we fail the most. So yes, you should remember that. That's why we have translational medicine. But this early phase, it's important because if you're interested in that, well, that will be quite experimental. So there's a lot of uncertainty. You need to be really ready to do a lot of science there because that's the first time that your product will see a human volunteer and eventually a patient. So first in human, first in patient. So that's a special set of circumstances. And then you have the late clinical development, phase 2B, where you're optimizing your treatment administration, and phase 3, your pivotal trial that end up in your label. So this is very large. This is really dealing with a population of patients. You have epidemiology. You have like incredibly complex logistics, very large, usually very large scales trial. So that's kind of a different kind of frame of mind when you get to the development there. So depending on, what kind of aspect of clinical development interests you, you may be more inclined to do early development or late development. So these are quite different. So then you have clinical operations. So clinical operations are really the people now that you have designed the clinical development plan, these are the people that are really implementing it. And it's all about management, monitoring, and administration. So that's very important, but that's very nitty-gritty. And you may recognize a lot of the position there of the people that will do that. Then you have medical review and pharmacovigilance, because as you are running these trials, you're collecting a lot of data. And this data need to be reviewed because a lot of medical information there, especially related to adverse event and adverse reaction. That's all about pharmacovigilance. So, whoops, what did I do in there? Whoops. So that's where actually we'll get another set of people that will be responsible for that. So that's another opportunity there that you could be interested in. Another group in clinical development will be clinical biometry. So as it sounds like, yeah, those are people that, you remember, we're generating a lot of data. So not only we need to look at the medical information in the data, but we need to manage it, and we need to look at the statistical meaning there. So obviously, the clinical statistics out of it. So you get, again, another group of people that are doing that, and so that may be something that also could be of interest for you. Finally, you have clinical services. So what are they responsible for? Well, if you want to run your trial, you need to have your supplies at the right place, at the right time, in the right conditions. So that's all about supplies and logistics. So that means supply, storage, and shipment from where they are produced to where they are used and back to where they will be analyzed or disposed of. And so you have another group of people that need to take care of that. And so who are the employers? Obviously here, pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies will be very important. You remember the contract organizations, because a lot of, especially the smaller size companies, will have their work done by these contract organizations. You have consultant and consulting companies also that would employ people there, regulatory authorities, and obviously the clinical research center would employ a number of these people. So that was for clinical development. Now we're moving to the second group, commercialization and medical affairs. And using the wrong button. So what it's responsible for? Well, as it sounds like, it's about marketing, sales, and for medical affairs, that's the proper clinical use and monitoring of the approved drug. Because now what happens, the drug is going to the market. So how does it do there? So who are involved? So the first thing is market access. So your drug got approved, now it needs to be able to get to the patient. So this group deal with negotiating a fair drug price. And that means that you need to identify your payers. You need to convince the payers that your drug or your biomedical product is really bringing added value, and that because of that, it should be covered or reimbursed. And that's not trivial. And that's something that you need to do quite early on. As soon as you start to get evidence of what your product can do, that need to be done. And there's a whole set of people that need to be gathered to produce that work. Then you have pharmaceutical marketing, and these people are responsible to promoting the sales. Now, obviously here, as we know, it's in a highly regulated environment, so it needs to be done in a very specific way, according to very specific rules. And what we have is like, this is where you hear about market analysis, marketing strategy and plan, marketing channels and tools. And that's also where you hear about the drug commercial lifespan. As you remember in the first slide, it's like eventually, the drug get off patents and that's it, we're starting all over again. So it's not eternal, so there's a very definite set of phases in the life of a drug from an economic perspective. And you have another group of people that, position that would take care of that. Then you have pharmaceutical production and distribution, because obviously now you need to be sure that the drug is properly produced and distributed. So that's all about manufacturing and distribution, not only to wholesaler, but wholesaler to the community and the hospital pharmacies. So you have another group of positions that need to take care of that. And then you have the pharmaceutical sales, because now naturally you get them there, but now you need to be sure that the drug would be sold. And so naturally the sales here is like there's two purpose of the money that is made out of these sales. One is to reinvest the money in the new R&D activities, but also to the return of investment of the ROI to the shareholder and the investors. And obviously this promotion will be done to the prescribers for drugs that requires prescription, or to the pharmacist for the non-prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs. And you have another group of people that in position that will deal with this. And then finally, and not the least actually, because for me, this actually, through the master program, you are getting quite relevant training, especially if you have a medical background, for medical affairs, because medical affairs actually here is really bridging the gap between research and development and marketing. And they are very important, and they are part of commercialization, but they're really kind of a bridge there, and you will see why. Because actually, one of their responsibilities is obviously they're responsible to provide the scientific and the medical aspect of the marketing. But in addition to that, they also have to manage the medical communication and publication related to the biomedical product or the drug. They're dealing with the key opinion leaders, like the academic leaders and the medical leaders. They're putting together the advisory boards. They're also dealing with the medical information, providing the medical information to the health providers and the patients, and also collecting the information from these stakeholders. And then, you remember I was telling you that when we talk about development, there's also the post-approval phase. Well, medical affairs is very involved into this, because they are the ones dealing with the investigator-initiated trials. Once the drug is out in the market, there's still things that you discover with the drugs, because now it's really dealing with real-life situation with the patient and the disease. And so this is actually a very important function in the pharmaceutical industry. And so you have a number of positions in medical affairs that are quite relevant actually for this master program. So who are the employers? Obviously the companies, Pharmaceutical and Biotechnology, the consulting companies, the CMO when it comes to the production of the drugs or the biomedical product, the payers, obviously, and that's it. So the last group actually are, and let's see here, the last group are support and management. And you remember support and management actually are relevant to both clinical development and commercialization and medical affairs. So what are they responsible for? That's providing the support to all the phases of the life drug cycles. And the first part actually, the first group is regulatory affairs or regulatory sciences. And they are very important because, as we said, the approval of a drug or a biomedical product is highly regulated. I mean, you have to go through the regulatory agency, in our case here, the FDA. And so their primary responsibilities is to be sure that the company is following legislation, regulation, and guidelines along the whole process, from the first thing done at the bench to the last thing done with the patient, or the manufacturing of the drug, and also they are the main players when it comes to negotiation with the regulatory authorities. They are also the key players, being responsible to be sure that the regulatory documents are properly prepared, assembled, and sent to the right authorities in time. And this is extremely, extremely critical. Again, a number of positions will be involved to deliver these things. Another group in this support and management will be quality management. And what they are responsible for, well, is quality assurance across the whole line. You remember we were talking about some of these good practices at the beginning. One that is very important for you guys is good clinical practices, but you have a whole collection that as a whole, we call GXPs. So these are the people that ensures that all the GXPs are properly applied. And to do that, they are translating that into specific SOPs. So that's what the quality management people are doing. And here, who they are. And also a very important group there is scientific and medical writing. And that's another place also where, with the training that you're acquiring, that's also a place where you can make a contribution, because these people have a very important job, is writing study report, publication, regulatory documents in accordance with established rules and regulations. And that requires a really extensive understanding of the whole process from beginning to end. And so this is often very underestimated, what is needed out of scientific and medical writing. And again, here you have a wide breadth of people involved in this, because you really need very diverse set of expertise to do it properly. Then you also have training and development, because obviously here you need to be able to do a proper induction training for newcomers in a company, and that we're talking about strategic thinking, about knowledge transfer. There's also the continuous training and development, because things and needs are evolving, and so here you are getting all sorts of trainers because of the very varied needs. And finally, and not the least, you have management. And here we're talking about two types of management: strategic management and operational management. Strategic management, we talk about innovation, portfolio, or risk management that you may hear quite a lot. Go, no-go decision making, which is key in the industry. Operational management, it's project management, clinical sales operation, that kind of thing. And you have a number of positions there. So the employers would be, again, pharmaceutical and biotechnology company, the contract organization, consulting companies, the payers, regulatory authorities, and the clinical research center. So basically the whole set of players in the ecosystem. Now here what I put there is just tables that give you a taste of, depending on your discipline, your degrees, like where things are fitting. And essentially you can see that pretty much across the three areas, early clinical development, late, and commercialization and medical affairs, you get these wide breadth of competencies that are contributing to the final result. And here, just again, as guidance, so where would you find job listing for that? And so the big sites where you could find number of positions would be Indeed, for instance, Monster, LinkedIn, Pharmyweb.com would be like the typical places where the company would advertise. If you want to look at the different potential salary range for the different positions, salary.com, PayScale, Glassdoor would be typical sites that would provide relevant information there. What you have to remember is that an industry type resume is a little bit different from an academic type, and so typically here it's like your recent experience is what matters the most. You would have like a little bit of different sets of headers. You need to be sure that your resume could, be treated electronically, because what happens is very often, especially for the larger organization, it will be treated by a machine before somebody can really look at it. So something to consider. Also, you should consider advertising yourself to recruiters. That's kind of very important there. And that's where LinkedIn, for instance, could be a very good way to connect yourself to a recruiter. And very often what happens is like you will receive email or phone calls from recruiter that will say, well, you know, would you be interested in this or that? And, you know, you're on their radar screen, and that's good. Networking, local associations, professional associations, that's very important. Go back to what Dr. Mehta was saying. It's just, communication. That's, and then if you've been selected, what happened? Well, what's very important is, you need to study the company, study the employer, be prepared, have questions. They react to that because it's very competitive. So you need to distinguish yourself. Very often it could start with a phone interview, and you don't have the opportunity to be there physically, and so you need really you having done your homework can make the difference, especially in a phone interview. And then, if you're lucky, you'll pass the phone interview, and now they will have a face-to-face. Very often, especially if it has some leadership responsibilities or management responsibilities, you may be asked to give a little talk or something like that. So you need to be ready for that too. That's quite important. Be sure that you can provide relatively rapidly letter of references or names, because very often what they could do is that they would contact your references by phone, and so that you have references that you could rely on, that could vouch for you and be available to answer the recruiter by phone. And even if it doesn't work, always send a thank you note, because it's a small world and it didn't work for that, but you may have to come back later. So it's good to keep good relationships. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. As I said, unfortunately, it's not very inspirational, but hopefully it was informative. So I encourage you to explore the different site if you think that this could interest you. And obviously, you could always follow up with me if you have specific questions, or I could connect you to people. That's it. Thank you.